We've now got our header complete. It looks fantastic, and we can definitely use it again on future projects wherever we need a header. And as a matter of fact, I'll tell you right now that that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take a lot of components out of this application and use them on future components in the future. So we're now ready to move on to the main body of our application, the big list of albums that users will scroll through. Remember the whole point of our app, we want to have a list of albums to show to the user. In this mock-up right here, I'm just showing a single album, but really there should be multiple albums that users should be able to scroll through. This means that we have two big challenges now lined up for us. Number one, we need to figure out how to get a list of albums to show to the user. So literally a list of images with album images, album name, artist title, all that kind of good stuff. We need a list of them to show to the user. That's challenge number one. And challenge number two is, once we figure out how we will get access to that list of data, we need to figure out how we're going to kind of architect, how we're going to architect our components to show a list of content to the users. So essentially, we need to know how to build a list of content. That's the big challenge here. That's what we have to figure out how to do. So let's do this one step at a time. We're going to start off with talking about how we're going to get a list of albums to show to the user. Now, we certainly could hard code a list of albums in our code base here. We can just say, here's a list of albums, here's where the images are, all that kind of good stuff. But you know what? That is not the best flow for our application. And here's the reason for that. When we go and deploy this application to the App Store, be it the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, it takes a while to deploy our application. Like, it has to go through a deploy process of several days. So if it turns out that one day we decide we want to update our list of albums on the fly, well, we're out of luck. We have to make an update to our app before it can get published to the App Store, and that can take several days. So instead, I'm going to suggest that we make that we retrieve a list of albums to show to the user from some online endpoint, from some API. I've already taken the liberty of setting up an API that will display a list of albums for us. Let's go check it out. In my browser, I'm going to navigate to rallycoding.herokuapp.com/API/music albums. One quick thing here, make sure you're going to herokuapp.com and not just Heroku. So let's check this out. Okay, so here's our list of albums. When we make a GET request to this endpoint, we get back an array of objects where each object represents one album that will show to the user. So in total, we have 5 albums to show to our user with data from this endpoint. Note that if your JSON, as it appears on the screen, doesn't look as nice as this, if it's just a big blob of text, that's totally fine. I just have a plugin that formats JSON nicely for me. So this is the data that we will want to somehow fetch to our application and show to our user once we've loaded it. So we need to figure out how to make an AJAX request or an HTTP request from our mobile application to fetch this list of data. And then more critically, once we have the list of data or all these different albums, we need to figure out a way to build a list out of all these different albums, all these different objects right here. So that's our goal. For step 2, once we fetch this data, we need to build a list of albums. Let's do a quick discussion about how we might design some components to do this. I'm going to suggest that we make 2 separate components to show this list of albums to our user. First, we'll make a single component called an album list. The purpose of album list will be to fetch the list of data, or fetch the list of albums, and then once it has been fetched, it will render several album detail components. So we'll have an album list and an album detail. The purpose of album detail right here is just to show a single card to our user. The thing that has the album name, the image, and the Buy Now button at the bottom. So album detail is about just showing a single album, whereas album list is about fetching that list of data and then rendering multiple album details. Okay, so that's our plan. Let's take a quick break and then continue in the next section and start setting up the scaffold for this album list and album detail, and also figure out exactly how we're going to fetch that list of albums via an HTTP request. In the last section, we spoke about how we're going to source our data for list of albums. We're going to make an AJAX request to that Heroku app endpoint to grab a list of objects where each object represents one album. That list of data will be pushed into this new component that we're going to call album list. So album list is going to be responsible for fetching that album data. And then once it fetches that data, it will display one album detail component per album that got fetched. The album list will be a child of the app component, and the app component also right now is showing the header component as well. So I hope this is starting to give you a little bit better sense of how we start to nest and put views together, or components, to form a larger, more complex application. So let's get started on our album list component. The first thing we're going to do is make this component. We're going to put some dummy text in there, and then we're going to make sure that it renders inside the app. After we put together some initial scaffold for the album list component, we're going to work on fetching our album data from that remote endpoint. So let's get to it. Inside of my project directory, I'm going to make a new file to house my album list component. Remember, one file, one component. So in my components directory, I'll make a new file called albumlist.js. Take note here that I'm using capitals for album and list. I made a little bit of mistake in the past when I used a lowercase header here. So moving forward, we're going to have capital letters for all of our component names. If you want to go back and rename the header with the capital H, certainly go for it. I advocate that capitalization scheme, but I'm not going to take the time right now to go back and fix it up. So here's our album list. So inside of here, we'll put in some boilerplate and then just show it inside of our app component and call it good. So at the very top, we'll do the 2 imports for what we need with every component we place. First, we will import React from React. Then we will import, and I'm going to just assume right now that I'm going to want a view tag and a text tag from React Native. Next, we will create our actual component. So const album list, and this is going to return some amount of JSX. So for right now, I'm just going to return a view tag, and inside of this view tag, I'm going to place some text that just says album list. Just something to get us started. Finally, at the bottom of the file, I'll export this component that we just created. So export default album list. This right here, I'm going to refer to as our component boilerplate. It's something that we're going to be typing out again and again and again. I guarantee you are going to get this boilerplate down pat by the time you get through the end of this course, because we're going to make probably, I don't know, a dozen or 2 different components. So we're going to be writing this out a lot. All right, so here's our album list component. We now want to show it inside of the app component. So I'll save this file, and then we're going to flip back over to the file that has our app component, which for me is index.ios.js. If you are on Android or developing for Android, you will open up index.android.js. We will then import that component at the top. So we will import album list from, and then remember, because this is a component that we wrote, it's something that we authored, we are going to give the relative path to that file. So starting in the current directory, which I represent with a /, go into the source directory, go into components, and then get album list. So into source, components, album list. Because this is a JavaScript file ending in .js, I do not have to put on the file extension here. So I do not have to put on the .js. I can, but I don't have to. Okay, so here's our album list. We now want to show it within the app component. Here's a little trick about JSX, or maybe trick isn't the correct word. Maybe I need to say requirement. For any component that we create, we must return a single top-level JSX tag. So I can't just add in album list like so. This is not valid JSX because I'm trying to return 2 siblings at one time. This would be completely equivalent to returning something like, return 1 and then return 2. It doesn't work out. You're just going to try to return 1 and you're never going to reach return statement 2. That's more or less what is happening here with the JSX. So whenever I have multiple tags I want to return at the same time, I will instead wrap them with a single view tag. That means I will satisfy my requirement of returning a single top-level tag. So let's do that. Up at the top, at my import statement from React Native, I'm going to add in a view tag. And now I'm going to wrap my header and my album list with a single view tag. So I'll place a view, and then I'll close the view off, like so. Cool, so I'm returning one top level tag that contains two components inside of it. Like I said previously, view tags are without a doubt the Swiss Army knife of tags. We use them for all different types of utility, and over time you'll definitely get more used to, or at least more familiar with the different uses of the view tag. All right, let's test this out in our simulator just to make sure that we didn't make a typo or anything. I'll pop open my simulator, I'll refresh, and there's my album list text right here. Okay, so off to a great start. Let's continue in the next section and work on making an AJAX request from our album list component to fetch our list of items. We've now got a starting component put together for our album list, which means we now need to figure out somehow an album list to make an HTTP request to go and fetch our list of albums. To solve this problem, we're going to have to expand our knowledge of React in a pretty big way. So remember, the big challenge here is how to make an HTTP request with React. Up until this point, the components that we have made, we referred to as functional components. So all the components we made, we would refer to as functional components. That is, they are functions that return some amount of JSX to be displayed on the device. And so as we look at album list right here, it's a functional component. The only rule behind these is that they must return some amount of JSX. That's pretty much it. To handle fetching of data, we're going to have to use a second type of component, which is called a class-based component. So I'm now introducing a second type of component that we're going to be creating. Let's check out a diagram to look at some of the differences between functional components and class-based components. As I mentioned, we've been using functional components up to this point, and I've got an example one down here at the bottom. Functional components are great for introduction to React, but their functionality, so to speak, is a little bit limited. You can kind of view them as through an analogy of like a garden hose or a pipe. You put data in one end, and JSX comes out the other. And that's it. There's no other ability for the component to fetch data or initiate more complicated operations that we'll figure out later on. It's just data goes in, JSX comes out. That's it. We traditionally use functional components for presentational needs, like just displaying some content to the user. A fantastic example of this would be the header component that we put together earlier. The header, all it has to do is take some header text and show a header. That's it. So that is a perfect use case for a functional component. The second type of component that we're going to use is the class-based component. Class-based components are more complex and they involve writing more code, but they have a lot more functionality built to them, a lot more capability. They can be used for fetching data, they're easier to use to write large components, and it's also easier to organize large amounts of code with them because we get a nice class type structure where we can add many helper methods in there. This type of component is called class-based because it is based on ES6 classes that extend a base class of component. This component base class is provided by React, and we'll figure out how to wire that up. In short, we're going to need to refactor this album list component from a functional component to a class-based one because we want to use it to fetch some data with an HTTP request. Okay, so that's basically our goal right now. We're going to do the refactor, and we're going to find out exactly how to use a class-based component to make an AJAX request. So, time to do our refactor. We're going from this functional component to a class-based one. To refactor to an ES6 class, we are going to delete the function declaration at the top, so that's step one. I'm just going to delete the entire thing, and I'm going to replace it with a class declaration instead. To declare an ES6 class, we first write the class keyword, then the name of the class, which for us is going to be album list, and then the class we want to extend from. So extends component. And then I'm going to place an opening curly brace. So I've got my opening curly brace up top and my closing curly brace down here at the bottom. By using extends component right here, we are indicating that we want to borrow a bunch of functionality from this base component class. So do recall that all files in a React Native project are kind of like silos. So I'm making a reference to component here, but I don't have any declaration of component ahead of time. So I need to make sure that I import component. This component base class can be imported from the React library. Now, unlike the destructuring that we used previously, I don't want to replace this React declaration with just destructuring out component to get access to component. And the reason for that is, keep in mind that whenever we write JSX, like right here, when Babel goes through this and converts the JSX to just raw JavaScript, it's going to turn all its JSX into a series of react.createElement calls, right? We saw that in the Babel REPL. And so because it says specifically react.createElement, I have to keep React in the scope of this file. So that's just a little bit of trivia. So to both import React, but also destructure the component class out of it, we're going to use a little bit of a trick with import statements. I'm going to say import React. And by the way, I also want this component property from the React library as well. So now we're both getting the React library and we're also receiving the component class out of it as well. Okay, one last thing to do to complete our refactor. I placed my class declaration, I've got the closing curly brace, but now I've just got this kind of loose chunk of code that's sitting in here right now. Whenever I write a class-based component, we must define exactly one method, and that method is called the render method. And the only requirement of the render method is that it returns some amount of JSX. So whereas before we had a functional component that returns some amount of JSX, we're now going to have a render method that returns some amount of JSX. So I'm going to add in here a render method by typing out render, an opening curly brace, and I'm going to wrap all this JSX with the closing curly brace and then indent like so. Finally, at the very bottom, I'm going to remove the semicolon because classes do not require semicolons. Okay, so that's it. So one more time, we refactored this from a functional component to a class-based component. We use class-based components whenever we want to use React to fetch data or whenever we want to have a large component that might require some helper methods. The only requirement of class-based components is that we define a render method that returns some amount of JSX. Then whenever this component gets rendered to the device, React is going to call the render method, take whatever JSX gets returned, and place it on the screen of our device. So at this point in time, we should be able to refresh the simulator and still see the text album list pop up on the screen. So I will refresh, and hot dog, we still got all album list popping up here. Okay, so fantastic. We did our refactor. Let's continue in the next section and figure out exactly how we use class-based components to fetch data for our application. We've now got our class-based component, so it's time for us to figure out how to use this to fetch some data for our application. So the first question we must ask ourselves is, when exactly do we want to fetch some data from the API? Like when our program first boots up, when are we going to decide, hey, this is now the time for me to fetch some data from the API and get that list of albums? Well, we probably want to fetch that data as soon as our app boots up. There's no like buttons in this application for the user to press that says like, oh, okay, now I want to load data here. We just want to say, as soon as this thing is about to load up, as soon as it's about to display on the screen, I want to go and fetch some data. So to make that happen, we need some type of like a hook or some event notification of when this component right here is about to be rendered onto the screen of our device. Fortunately, React has us covered. This is one of the benefits of class-based components. Class-based components have a unique advantage over functional components called lifecycle methods. So keyword term there, lifecycle methods. Remember earlier when I mentioned that functional components are like a hose, right? Like some data goes in and JSX comes out. In juxtaposition with that, or kind of opposed to that, are class-based components, which have a lot more knowledge of themselves. Like this class-based component It knows when it's about to be rendered. It knows when it's about to be removed from the screen. It has more sentience about what's going on inside the application. So they know exactly when they are about to be rendered to the screen, and we can get notification of that by using a lifecycle method. Lifecycle methods are functions that we'll place on our class that will be automatically called at some point. One such lifecycle method is called component_will_mount. So we can define a method on the class called specifically component_will_mount. Anytime that our component is about to be rendered to the screen, or screen of our device, this method will automatically be executed. It will automatically be called for us. So I'll place component_will_mount on my class. And now, just because I defined a method specifically with this name, it will automatically be executed as soon as this component's about to be rendered to the screen. So, hey, I don't know, maybe I'm telling the truth here, right? Maybe I'm lying, I don't know. Let's throw a console log in here just to verify that, yep, this thing is actually getting called automatically for us. So I'm gonna say console log, and let's just say component_will_mount in album list. So our expectation here is that when I refresh the simulator, I should see this console log, I don't know, somewhere, right? I should see a console log pop up that says this right here, just instantly. So let's flip over to the simulator and refresh, and oh yeah, where in the world do console logs pop up, right? We haven't spoken about that at all. So we haven't really spoken about how we debug our application with React Native at all. How do we debug this? How do we get any feedback from our application? Clearly, there's no console log here. There's no console log in our terminal, wherever the terminal might be. Here we go. So here's my packager right here. There's no console logs here. So somewhere we must be getting some debug feedback. So to get this debug feedback from React Native, we're going to use the built-in debugger with React Native. While having my simulator focused, I'm going to press Command D on my keyboard to open up the React Native development menu. In the side of this menu, I'm going to find debug.js remotely, and then just go ahead and click it. When I click it, a Chrome window automatically picks up, or whatever browser you might be using. This Chrome tab right here is automatically linked up to the simulator, and you can kind of think of this as an extension of the React Native application that's running. So I can use this Chrome instance, this Chrome window, to debug my React Native code. Let's see how it works. I'm going to open up the development console by just right-clicking anywhere on the screen, and then click on Inspect. And then if I select the console tab, let me zoom in a little bit here just to make it nice and large, you can see the console log component_will_mount in album list. So clearly this Chrome window right here is very cleverly, with some God knows what magic, honestly it is total magic, hooked up to the iOS simulator, and any console logs or any warnings or any errors, anything whatsoever that we place inside of our code is going to appear inside of this browser window here. So having your Chrome window open, hooked up to the React Native emulator, or simulator I should say, is a fantastic way to debug your code. We will be using console logs on and off throughout the rest of this course just to verify that things are running and do some debugging. The one thing that I also want to mention that we won't really be doing too much is that if I want, I can also place debugger statements inside of my code. So I'll place debugger right here, and then if I flip back over to Chrome, flip back over to my my simulator, and if I refresh it, Chrome will automatically hit that debug breakpoint and enter into debug mode. So here we go. So I'm paused on execution right here on the debug statement. And so at this point in time, I can do some console logs, inspect some variables like, hey, what's this? What's the value of this right here? Oh, okay, it's album list. So using debugger statements, absolutely fantastic for figuring out what is going on with your code. Highly recommend it. Okay, so a little bit of a quick aside there about debugging. Getting back on topic, and by the way, I'm going to flip back over and remove that debugger statement. And I'm also going to make sure that I continue execution of my code by clicking the play button right here. And I should now see, yep, I still got album list popping up on the screen. Perfect, okay. So getting back to where we were, clearly component will mount right here is a fantastic location to initiate some loading of data or some HTTP request to go and fetch our data and retrieve it for our application. So let's continue in the next section and figure out exactly how we are going to make that network request. We now have a class-based component which allows us access to lifecycle methods like component will mount. There's a couple other lifecycle methods that we're going to learn about over time, but for right now we just care about component will mount. As a reminder, component will mount is called the instant this component is about to be placed on the screen of the mobile device, which makes it a fantastic location to start initiating some data loading process for our application. So now we know where we want to make the AJAX request. All that remains is actually making the AJAX request. So we need to somehow make an HTTP request and go fetch our data from this remote API. To make the actual request, fortunately it's not the worst thing in the world. It's kind of straightforward actually, not a lot of code for us to write. To do so, we're going to install a library called Axios. So over in my project directory, I'm inside of albums right now, I'm going to install the Axios library by using npm. So I'll write out npm install -- save Axios. So the sole purpose of Axios for us is just to make an HTTP request to fetch some data. That is all we're using it for here. So after the installation is complete, there we go, fantastic. We'll flip back over to our component and we need to import that library into this file right here. Remember, just installing it doesn't do anything for us. We actually have to import it into our file. So at the top, we will import Axios from Axios. Then inside of component will mount, I'm going to take out the console log statement. We don't really need it anymore. And instead, we will make our HTTP request. To make a GET request, like a GET type request, which is going to be used to fetch our data, we will use axios.get, and then we just have to pass in the URL to our remote API. So if you recall, it is HTTPS. Make sure, please, 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 that you are using HTTPS here, not HTTP. // was it course API? No. Okay, I need to go double check. rallycoding.herokuapp.com. I was way off there. Okay, rallycoding.herokuapp. Make sure that you have Heroku app, not just Heroku.com /API/music albums. Cool. So whenever we make an HTTP request with Axios, making the actual request, or this function call right here, returns a promise back to us. It returns a promise because making an HTTP request is inherently asynchronous. So we need to use a promise to get some type of notification that, oh hey, like AJAX request or HTTP request is now complete. Our data's here. Here you go. So we will chain on a .then statement, and to this .then we will pass a function. And so the whole purpose of the promise here is that this function that we pass to .then will be called once the HTTP request is complete. So it will be called with the response from that API. So let's put on response, and for now we'll just console log it. We'll see what we're working with. Okay. All right. So I'm going to flip over to our debugger. So here's our debugger. And I'll refresh the simulator. So my expectation is that when I refresh our simulator, it will automatically make our HTTP request, and I should see the data pop up in our console. So I'll refresh. And eventually something's going to happen. There we go. Okay, very good. So now here's my console log. I can expand this. So this is the response object that was passed back to us from Axios. So I see a status of 200, which means, hey, request successful, everything's good to go. And you'll notice I have this data property right here. So if I expand data, I've got 5 entries, and each one is an individual album. Fantastic. That's it. That's the data that we need to show inside of our application. So this is exactly what we need. So it looks like we're all set. Oh, you know what? I totally forgot. We would be set if it wasn't for one tiny little problem. Just a tiny little problem here. I'm going to pull open a diagram really quick. All right. So we got one just tiny little issue that we're going to have to figure out here. I want to walk through the timeline of our application right now. Okay, I want to walk through it and figure out what's going on. So going down is time. So first we start up our application and then basically some stuff happens. So let's walk through it step by step. When we refresh the simulator, React Native boots up and it says, okay, I'm booting up. I need to show that app component on the screen. I'm gonna go ahead and render it. When we render the app component, it renders itself, it renders the header, and it renders the album list. When the album list gets rendered, it says, I'm a class-based component. I'm about to be rendered to the screen, and I have a lifecycle method called component will mount. I'm supposed to call that, so I'm going to call it component will mount. So component will mount is executed, and inside of there we've got some amount of code that is going to issue an HTTP request. So we make the HTTP request using Axios. Now the key here, the thing that I want to really keep your mind on, is that when we make an HTTP request that is inherently asynchronous, and by asynchronous I mean it takes some amount of time to complete that network request. And we have no idea how long it's going to take, especially on a mobile device. It might take 50 milliseconds, it might take 50 seconds on the mobile device. We have no idea. So the instant after we make that HTTP request, the request is still pending. It's still just kind of sitting out there on the wire. And immediately after that, our app component, our album list component, and our header component appear on the screen. And at that point in time, the album list is completely empty. It has no data whatsoever, right? Of course, we don't really have any JSX. We just have like the text in there. But in theory, if we had some logic in there to render a list of albums, at the point in time that the album list first renders, it has no data to show on the screen. Okay, so then kind of the ... which means we're waiting for the request to complete. After some number of milliseconds, our HTTP request completes and we get back some JSON data. And that data is the stuff we actually want to show on the screen. And so here's the key. Here's the big issue. Here's what's going wrong. We have an order of operations problem. We make our HTTP request, we try to render some stuff at the screen, we have no data to show, and then sometime later we actually get our data. And right now, as it stands right now, we have absolutely no logic in there whatsoever to say, oh, our AJAX request just completed, we need to re-render our component somehow. We need to take this data and actually show it on the screen. We have zero logic for that whatsoever. So that is what the big problem is. We need to figure out some way to make our album list re-render a second time when our HTTP request completes and we've got some data to show on the screen. So that's essentially it. That's our big issue. We need to figure out how to tell the album list to re-render. So this is a big challenge. Let's continue in the next section and figure out how we're going to solve it. In the last section, we successfully fetched album data from our API, but we realized that there was a big fundamental flaw in the timeline of our app related to the order in which we fetch data and show content in the screen. By the time our data has been fetched, all of our components have already appeared on the screen, which is keeping us from having kind of any opportunity to show the data that we just fetched. So it's an order of operations problem. In this section, we'll figure out the best way for dealing with this issue. The technique we'll use to solve this timeline issue is called component state. State is how React handles changing the content that is shown on the screen. So let's look at a practical example of how this works. This diagram shows the two possible states of our album list component. It either has an empty list of albums, so we get no albums to show on the screen whatsoever, we haven't fetched our data yet, or we have some list of albums to show on the screen, so maybe like an array of objects where each album has like a name or something like that. The event that separates these two different states is fetching our data. So we either have data or we do not. In theory, when we have not fetched our data, we have kind of like an empty state or a lack of any albums. So this is just a little bit of the theory behind the term state. So let's pivot a little bit now and talk about how state works with React. With React components, we'll have the same type of migration of state. We will have this kind of empty list of albums, and we will have a full list of albums, two different possible states that our component will be in. In React, anytime that we change the state of our component will automatically re-render itself to the mobile device's screen, which is exactly the behavior we are looking for. So we are going to, in this section, walk through the process of enabling what is called component level state inside of our album list component. And the goal here is that we're going to use component level state to tell our component, hey, I just fetched a list of albums. Here they are. You need to re-render yourself with this new list of data. Okay, so fixing up our component, it's going to take 3 steps, exactly 3. First, we are going to set some default or initial state for our component. Second, when we fetch our data, we are going to tell our component state to update. And finally, we will make sure that our component makes use of the state. So it actually says like, oh, I've got this kind of state thing. I'm going to tweak my render method to make sure that I consume or make use of that state. Just to make sure that I'm really clear here, when I use this word state, this is an actual system that is built into React, so it is not just like a arbitrary or random word. The component base level class here has a bunch of functionality built into it that handles dealing with this kind of state system that I'm referring to. Okay, so 3 steps here. Let's start with the first, setting up some default or initial state for our component. To set up some default state, we are going to add what is called a class level property. A class level property looks like this. We say just state equals empty object. In the past, well, let me take a quick aside here and say that this state declaration I just added with React has gone through a lot of different iterations on exactly how you declare state or initialize it. So you might be used to seeing other tutorials where it uses the constructor or other tutorials where it uses a method called getInitialState. They're all doing essentially the same thing. They're just saying, hey, this component, when it gets created, has some initial empty state or some like initial base state. Whenever our component is created, it will now have a property called this.state, and it will be set to an empty object. And we refer to this as our initial or empty state. So by default, we're saying that inside of our component, or kind of like in the context of our component, we're going to have an empty list of albums when we first render our component. So I'm going to say that I have a albums piece of state, and it should start off as an empty list. So inside of my state object, I'm going to say albums is an empty array. So I've now got an albums piece of state, and it's an empty array to start off. So when our component first renders, it will have access to a variable that we can make reference to inside of render right here as this.state.albums, and that's going to return an empty array. Okay, so that's it for step number 1. We now have set up some reasonable default or kind of like initial state for our component. Now for step number 2. Step number 2, we need to make sure that after we fetch our data, we take that state and we update our component state. So this step here is going to be just a little bit tricky, all right? Just a little bit tricky, but we're going to write out the syntax for it. We're going to write out the code, and then we'll talk about exactly what's going on with it. So after I fetch my list of albums, which is right in here, this callback function right here, I'm going to delete the console log, and I'm going to instead replace it with this.setState. I'm going to pass in an object with a key of albums and a value of response.data. So first things first, remember that when we looked at that request in Chrome, when we looked at the console log, the list of albums was available on the response as response.data. So that is why I'm using response.data right here. Second off, we are passing an object to this function setState. We are passing an object of albums, pointing at the actual list of albums, because I am updating my albums piece of state. So after I fetch my list of albums, I'm no longer going to have this.state.albums equal to an empty array, I'm going to have this.state.albums equal to an array full of objects. Finally, you'll notice that I used a function here called this.setState. So setState is a function that is automatically implemented for us by this component-based class. So we're not going to define setState. We don't have to do anything like that. It's just a function that already exists inside of any of our class-based components. The purpose of setState is to update our component state and say, hey, here's like some new data for the component. We now need to re-render this component with this new data that we have. That's the entire purpose of setState right here. One thing that I want to point out to you in particular is that using this setState method right here is the only way in which we update our component state. We will never ever say something like this.state equals albums blah blah, whatever else. We never ever say this.state equals anything. We always modify or update our state by using this.setState, and we'll talk about why the case of that is in the future in a little bit. You will notice that we do kind of break that rule up here where we say state equals blah blah blah. The difference there is that this is for initializing, not for modification. So this is like the one time in which we do say state equals something something. Okay, so remember, the entire point of this is that we are using component level state to get access to the list of albums and re-render our component whenever we have successfully fetched them. So to just kind of see what the result of adding the state code is, to just kind of figure out what's going on here, inside of my render method, I'm going to add in a console log of this.state. Okay, so I'm not going to say, I've been lecturing long enough, I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to shut up entirely if I can. I will try. Let's flip over to simulator. We'll do our refresh and let's see what happens, right? Let's just see what happens. So I'll flip over to Chrome, wait for the console log to pick up. Okay, so here's my two console logs. I've got a console log of albums pointing at an empty array, and then I've got a console log of albums with 5 albums in this list right here. So, all right, this looks interesting. This means that our render method is occurring twice, or it's running twice, which is definitely towards what we're getting at. Let's take a quick break and review exactly what's going on here.